What could drive a celebrated war hero to become one of history's most depraved killers? On October 26, 1440, thousands gathered to witness the flames consume the body of Gilles de Rais, a man who had once stood beside Joan of Arc as a champion of France, only to descend into such monstrous depravity that his very name became synonymous with unspeakable evil. This is the story of how absolute power corrupted absolutely, and how justice, when it finally arrived, matched the horror of the crimes in its brutal finality. The medieval world was no stranger to violence. Yet even by the harsh standards of the 15th century, the crimes of Gilles de Rais shocked contemporary society to its core. His transformation from respected nobleman to child-murdering monster reveals the darkest possibilities of unchecked authority and the terrifying depths to which the human soul can sink when freed from moral constraints. Gilles de Rais was born into privilege around 1404, inheriting vast estates across Brittany and Anjou that made him one of the wealthiest men in France. His early years promised nothing but honor. He distinguished himself as a military commander during the 100 Years' War, fighting alongside Joan of Arc during her miraculous campaigns to drive the English from French soil. At the Siege of Orléans in 1429, the young baron earned his place in history as one of Joan's most trusted lieutenants. The sight of Gilles de Rais in those days would have inspired confidence and admiration. Tall, powerfully built, with flowing dark hair and the bearing of nobility, he commanded respect on the battlefield and in the royal court. King Charles VII rewarded his service by appointing him Marshal of France, one of the highest military honors in the realm. His banner flew alongside Joan's, and his sword helped secure French victories that seemed impossible just months before. But even in these glory days, troubling signs existed for those who knew how to look. Gilles displayed an unusual fascination with wealth and luxury that bordered on obsession. His personal expenses were enormous. He maintained a private chapel with a choir of hundreds, staged elaborate theatrical productions, and surrounded himself with alchemists and scholars whose interests veered toward the occult. The seeds of his later corruption were perhaps already taking root in the fertile soil of unlimited power and unchecked desire. When Joan of Arc was captured by the English in 1430 and subsequently burned at the stake, something fundamental changed in Gilles de Rais. The loss of his comrade in arms, combined with the end of his military glory, left him searching for new forms of stimulation and power. It was then that he began his descent into the darkness that would ultimately consume him. Following Joan's death, Gilles retreated to his sprawling estates, particularly his imposing castle at Machecoul in Brittany. Away from the scrutiny of court and battlefield, he began to indulge his darkest impulses. His enormous wealth, estimated at over 200,000 livres, equivalent to millions today, allowed him to pursue any interest without restraint. Unfortunately, those interests grew increasingly sinister. The baron became obsessed with alchemy, convinced he could transmute base metals into gold through arcane rituals. He surrounded himself with practitioners of the dark arts, most notably an Italian magician named Francesco Prelati, who claimed to know the secrets of demonic conjuration. Under Prelati's influence, Gilles began performing increasingly elaborate occult ceremonies, seeking to summon demons who would grant him unlimited wealth and power. These rituals required sacrifices, and it was here that Gilles's corruption reached its most horrific depths. Initially, he may have used animals, but the historical record suggests he quickly graduated to human victims, specifically children, whom he believed would be more pleasing to the demonic entities he sought to summon. The isolated nature of his castles, combined with his absolute authority over his domains, created the perfect environment for these atrocities to flourish unchecked. His transformation was complete. The man who had once fought for the liberation of France now used his power and position to perpetrate crimes that defied comprehension. The castle walls that had once protected French interests now concealed horrors that would shock even the violence-hardened medieval world. Gilles de Rais maintained several castles across his territories, but it was at Machecoul and Tiffauges that the worst atrocities occurred. These fortresses, originally built for defense against external enemies, became prisons where innocent children faced tortures that chroniclers of the time could barely bring themselves to describe. The very stones of these castles bore witness to crimes that haunted the surrounding countryside for generations. The baron's method of acquiring victims was as calculated as it was cruel. He employed servants and accomplices who would venture into nearby villages and towns, seeking out children from poor families. These predators would approach desperate parents with offers of employment for their sons and daughters, promises of good food, warm shelter, and honest work in the baron's household. To families struggling with poverty and hunger, such offers seemed like divine providence. Once inside the castle walls, however, the children discovered the horrific reality of their situation. They were imprisoned in underground chambers, stripped of their clothing, and subjected to prolonged torture that served both Gillis's sadistic pleasure and his occult practices. Historical accounts, based on testimonies from his later trial, describe scenes of such depravity that even hardened medieval chroniclers struggled to record them. The children, some as young as 6 or 7 years old, were subjected to sexual assault, physical torture, and psychological torment before being murdered in ritualistic fashion. Some were strangled slowly while Gillis watched, deriving pleasure from their suffering. Others were decapitated or dismembered while still alive. The Baron reportedly took particular satisfaction in the moment of death, believing that the terror and pain of his victims somehow enhanced the power of his occult rituals. The full extent of Gilles de Rais's cruelty only became clear during his trial, when survivors among his accomplices testified about the systematic nature of his crimes. These testimonies, preserved in court records, provide a chilling glimpse into the mind of a man who had abandoned all human decency in pursuit of power and perverted pleasure. According to witness accounts, Gillis would often participate directly in the torture and murder of his victims. He was known to kiss children before killing them, a grotesque mockery of affection that preceded their destruction. The Baron seemed to derive particular pleasure from the contrast between his gentle demeanor and the horrific fate that awaited his victims. This psychological torture was as much a part of his sadism as the physical violence that followed. The methods of murder varied, but they shared a common thread of prolonged suffering. Some children were hung from hooks and slowly strangled, allowing Gillis to savor their final moments. Others were subjected to sexual assault so violent that it proved fatal. Still others were dismembered while conscious, their screams echoing through the castle chambers as the Baron watched with apparent satisfaction. After each murder, the bodies were burned in the castle's furnaces, destroying the evidence of the crimes. The ashes were scattered or buried in unmarked graves, ensuring that the victims' families would never know their children's fate. This systematic disposal of evidence allowed Gillis to continue his crimes for years without detection, protected by his noble status and the isolation of his domains. The sheer scale of the atrocities is difficult to comprehend. Conservative estimates suggest Gilles de Rais murdered at least 80 children, though some historians believe the number may have exceeded 200. Each death represented not just a life cut short, but a family destroyed by grief and uncertainty, never knowing what had become of their missing child. Gillis did not commit his crimes alone. He surrounded himself with accomplices who shared in his guilt, creating a network of complicity that enabled the atrocities to continue unchecked for years. These servants of evil included both willing participants who shared his sadistic inclinations and reluctant accomplices who were coerced or corrupted through a combination of threats and rewards. Chief among his accomplices were Henriette Griart and Etienne Correlot, known as Poitou, who served as his body servants and confidants. These men participated directly in the abduction, torture, and murder of children, carrying out their master's commands with apparent enthusiasm. They helped procure victims, assisted in the torture sessions, and disposed of the bodies afterward. Their loyalty to Gillis was absolute, bought with gold and sealed with shared guilt. Other accomplices included Gilles de Sille, his cousin and fellow nobleman, who provided both financial support and moral encouragement for the Baron's activities. The presence of another noble in this circle of corruption demonstrates how the privileges of aristocracy could shield even the most heinous crimes from investigation. De Sille's involvement also suggests that Gillis's depravity may have been more widespread among the nobility than historical records indicate. The Italian conjurer Francesco Prelati played a crucial role as well, providing the occult justification for the murders. He convinced Gillis that the deaths of innocent children were necessary for their magical workings, transforming murder into a religious ritual in the Baron's twisted mind. Prelati's influence demonstrates how superstition and pseudoscience could be used to rationalize the most terrible crimes. Even some of the castle's ordinary servants became complicit, either through fear or corruption. They maintained silence about the disappearances, helped clean up after the murders, and continued to serve a master they knew to be a monster. Their complicity reveals how power and authority can corrupt not just the powerful, but also those who serve them. For years, Gilles de Rais's noble status and immense wealth protected him from serious investigation. Medieval society was structured around deference to authority, and few dared to question the actions of a Marshal of France, regardless of the rumors that circulated among the peasantry. However, by the late 1430s, the whispers of missing children and dark practices had grown too loud to ignore. The first serious challenge to Gilles's authority came not from criminal investigators, but from the Catholic Church. His financial excesses had forced him to sell much of his inherited property, and his relatives had appealed to church authorities to prevent him from completely dissipating the family fortune. This legal action brought unwanted attention to his affairs and provided an opening for his enemies to act against him. In 1440, Gilles made a fatal error that would ultimately lead to his downfall. In a dispute over property, he kidnapped a cleric named Jean Le Ferron, holding him captive at his castle of Machecoul. This act of violence against a representative of the church was a crime that even his noble status could not protect him from. It provided church authorities with the legal justification they needed to investigate his other activities. The investigation, led by the Bishop of Nantes, initially focused on the kidnapping of the cleric. However, as investigators delved deeper into Gilles's affairs, they uncovered evidence of far more serious crimes. Witnesses came forward, servants who had finally found the courage to speak, parents who had lost children, and neighbors who had observed suspicious activities at the barons' castles. The mounting evidence painted a picture of systematic child murder that shocked even the investigators. The scale and brutality of the crimes went far beyond anything they had expected to uncover. What had begun as an investigation into a property dispute had revealed one of the most monstrous crime sprees in medieval history. The trial of Gilles de Rais began in September 1440 in the city of Nantes. Presided over by church authorities who had the legal jurisdiction to try cases involving both heresy and murder, the proceedings were unprecedented in their scope and complexity. As the court attempted to document and judge crimes that defied comprehension, the trial records, preserved in Latin, provide a detailed account of the evidence presented against the fallen baron. Initially, Gilles maintained his innocence and refused to recognize the court's authority to try him. He claimed that as a Marshal of France, he was subject only to royal justice, not ecclesiastical courts. This defiant stance quickly crumbled, however, as witness after witness testified to his crimes. The testimonies were so detailed and consistent that even Gilles's supporters began to abandon him. The court heard from parents who described their children's disappearances, from servants who had witnessed the murders, and from accomplices who had been granted immunity in exchange for their testimony. The evidence was overwhelming. Dozens of children had vanished in the vicinity of Gilles's castles, and multiple witnesses confirmed that they had seen these children entering the baron's domains, never to emerge again. Faced with irrefutable evidence and the threat of torture, Gilles finally confessed to his crimes in October 1440. His confession was extraordinary in its detail and apparent sincerity. He admitted to murdering children for both sexual gratification and occult purposes, describing his crimes with a mixture of remorse and disturbing satisfaction. He claimed to have killed more children than he could count, estimating the number at over 140 victims. The confession sent shockwaves through medieval society. Here was a man who had fought beside Joan of Arc, who had held the highest military honors in France, admitting to crimes that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. The contrast between his public persona and his private depravity was so stark that some questioned whether such evil could exist in a single human being. The court's verdict was inevitable given the overwhelming evidence and Gilles's own confession. On October 25, 1440, he was sentenced to death on multiple charges: murder, sodomy, heresy, and invoking demons. The sentence reflected both the severity of his crimes and the medieval belief that such evil could only be cleansed through complete destruction of the body. The method of execution chosen was particularly significant. Gilles was to be hanged until dead, then his body was to be burned to ash. This combination of hanging and burning was reserved for the most heinous criminals, particularly those guilty of heresy and crimes against children. The fire was believed to purify the corruption that had consumed his soul, while also serving as a warning to others who might contemplate similar crimes. The execution was scheduled for the following day, October 26, 1440, in a field outside Nantes. Word of the sentence spread quickly through the region, and thousands of people began gathering to witness the death of the men who had terrorized their communities for years. For many, The execution represented not just justice, but a form of collective exorcism that would finally rid them of the evil that had haunted their land. Gilles spent his final night in prayer, attended by priests who tried to prepare his soul for judgment. According to contemporary accounts, he showed genuine remorse for his crimes, weeping as he contemplated the suffering he had caused. Whether this repentance was sincere or merely a final performance remains a matter of historical debate, but it added another layer of complexity to an already extraordinary case. The condemned man's final hours were marked by a strange mixture of medieval piety and morbid spectacle. While he prepared for death through confession and prayer, thousands of spectators prepared for what would be one of the most significant public executions in medieval French history. October 26, 1440, dawned cold and grey over the city of Nantes. By mid-morning, an enormous crowd had gathered in the field designated for the execution. Conservative estimates suggest that over 10,000 people were present, nobles, clergy, merchants, craftsmen, and peasants, all united in their desire to witness the end of Gilles de Rais. The execution had become a public ritual of purification, a collective rejection of the evil that had poisoned their community. The condemned man was brought to the scaffold in a wooden cart, accompanied by priests and guards. According to eyewitness accounts, Gilles appeared calm and resigned to his fate. He was dressed in simple clothes, stripped of all the trappings of nobility that had once protected him from justice. The contrast between his present humiliation and his former glory was not lost on the crowd, many of whom had once cheered him as a war hero. The scaffold itself was a carefully constructed instrument of justice. The gallows stood high enough to be visible to the entire crowd, while below it a large pyre had been prepared with seasoned wood and straw. The symbolism was clear: the man who had burned the bodies of his victims would himself be consumed by flames, his ashes scattered to prevent any possibility of resurrection or veneration. Before the execution began, Gilles was given the opportunity to address the crowd. His final speech was reportedly brief but moving, as he asked forgiveness from God and from the families of his victims. He warned the assembled nobles against the sins of pride and excess that had led to his downfall, urging them to learn from his terrible example. Whether calculated or sincere, this final performance added to the drama of the moment. The execution itself was carried out with medieval efficiency. The noose was placed around Gilles's neck, and at the signal from the presiding judge, the trap was sprung. His body dropped, and after several minutes of struggle, the former Marshal of France was dead. But death was only the beginning of his punishment. The real spectacle was yet to come, as the flames prepared to consume what remained of the man who had once been a hero of France. As Gilles de Rais's lifeless body hung from the gallows, the executioners began the final phase of his punishment. The corpse was lowered onto the waiting pyre, positioned carefully to ensure complete combustion. The crowd watched in fascination and horror as the flames were lit, beginning the process that would reduce the once powerful baron to nothing more than ash and memory. Medieval executions by fire were designed to be both punishment and spectacle, and the burning of Gilles de Rais fulfilled both purposes magnificently. The flames rose high into the autumn sky, visible for miles around, announcing to all that justice had finally been served. The fire was fed continuously to ensure complete destruction. There would be no relics of this monster for misguided followers to venerate. The burning took several hours to complete, as the executioners ensured that every trace of the body was consumed. The crowd remained largely silent during this phase, many crossing themselves and praying as they witnessed the destruction of a man who had once been among the most powerful in France. The sight of the flames consuming his flesh served as a visceral reminder of the fate that awaited those who abandoned all moral restraint. According to contemporary chroniclers, the ashes of Gilles de Rais were scattered immediately after the fire died down, preventing any attempt to collect them as grotesque souvenirs. This final act of destruction was both practical and symbolic. It ensured that no physical trace of the monster remained, while also demonstrating the complete rejection of his crimes by civilized society. The execution and burning of Gilles de Rais marked the end of one of medieval Europe's most shocking crime sprees. The man who had once fought beside Joan of Arc for the liberation of France had been consumed by the same element that had claimed his former comrade in arms. But where Joan had been martyred for her faith and courage, Gilles was destroyed for his monstrous crimes against the innocent. The death of Gilles de Rais sent shockwaves throughout medieval Europe. But his story did not end with his execution. The crimes he committed and the manner of his death became the subject of countless chronicles, ballads, and moral lessons that would influence European culture for centuries to come. His name became synonymous with the corruption of power and the depths of human depravity. The case of Gilles de Rais demonstrated that even the highest-ranking nobles were not above the law when their crimes became too monstrous to ignore. His trial and execution marked a significant moment in medieval justice, showing that ecclesiastical courts could successfully prosecute even the most powerful criminals when secular authorities failed to act. This precedent would influence legal proceedings for generations to come. The psychological impact of his crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The revelation that a celebrated war hero could harbor such evil impulses forced medieval society to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of power and corruption. The story served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of moral constraints on those who wield power over others. Modern historians and psychologists have studied the case of Gilles de Rais as an early example of what we now recognize as serial killing motivated by sadistic impulses. His crimes exhibit many of the characteristics that criminologists associate with modern serial killers: the systematic targeting of vulnerable victims, the escalation of violence over time, and the combination of sexual and ritualistic elements in the murders. The story of Gilles de Rais continues to resonate today because it illustrates timeless truths about human nature and the corruption of power. His transformation from hero to monster serves as a reminder that evil can lurk behind the most respectable facades, and that vigilance is required to protect the innocent from those who would exploit their authority for malevolent purposes. The flames that consumed his body may have turned to ash centuries ago, but the lessons of his crimes burn on, warning each generation about the darkness that can consume the human soul when moral restraints are abandoned.